Welcome to Season 2 of Ventures and Visionaries, Episode 5, Making Sense of Optimism, Money, and Investments. This podcast is about vision and entrepreneurship, or business and innovation. I'm your host, Mordy Hackel. Welcome to the show. Our guest today is Zachary Karabell, author, researcher, speaker, and insightful optimist. Welcome, Zachary.
Thank you, Mordy.
I'm super excited to have you here today, particularly the optimism part, because that seems to be in rare doses these days. And I'd love to learn a little bit more about how you got into that mindset, and maybe share a little bit about your background and how you arrived into that perspective.
I think this one is more like nature rather than nurture. So one could argue that all of us fall somewhere on the cup half full, cup half empty spectrum, and that some of that is, if not predetermined, then very early expressed, right? So you can take a group of kindergartners, and some of them will be grumpy, and some of them will be happy, and some of them will be, looking at all the downside risks, and some of them will be looking at all the upside possibilities. And then that just kind of continues, deepens, and intensifies throughout life. And for sure, life experience can, I suppose, knock you from one end of the spectrum to the other. So huge business success at age 30, huge romantic success, maybe tilts you more in the direction of, hey, things could be great. And School of Hard Knocks might harden you and turn you more cynical rather than hopeful, or more bitter rather than open. That being said, I do think there's just a degree of, some of us are more oriented one way or the other. And then, of course, what do you do with that if you recognize it? So in my years as an investor, I was always aware of the fact that I was the person who was always going to look for, what's the cool new thing? What's the upside? What's the potential? And that's great if it gets you to invest in, Netflix or Google really early. Not so good on the verge of a crisis or identifying risks. So you should always surround yourself as much as possible with actual people or virtual people who can check you at the door, as it were. So if you're like a real pessimist, you should probably be around people who are saying, hey, wait a minute. And if you're a real optimist, you should probably be around people who are doing the same.
Finding balance is a good way of looking at it, I think. Thank you.
That being said, around 2011, I started writing a column for, at the time, Reuters, that also ran on The Atlantic, called the Edgy Optimist. And the point of that was, this was coming on the heels of the 2008-2009 financial crisis, that like the generalized attitude about the financial world at that time was still waiting for the other shoe to drop. So even though the worst of the crisis seemed to have been averted in 2009, by the time you got to 2010, 11, there was all this concern about the European Union disintegrating and all the talk of Grexit, and was Italy going to follow suit? So there was still a lot of apprehension and tentativeness, and a kind of expectation of there were other demons under the bed that we hadn't identified. And my perspective was, okay, maybe, but then there are all these possibilities that we're also not paying attention to that are upside possibilities. We're so relentlessly focused on downside risks that we're kind of missing the conversation about upside possibilities. The reason why I called it the Edgy Optimist was, I thought, look, if we return to some sort of 1990s giddy, everything's going to go well and the market's going to soar and technology is going to transform our lives all for the better and connect us and unify us and solve all the age-old problems. Had I been doing that column then, I would have been saying, hey, wait a minute, let's not get too ahead of ourselves. There's still a lot of problems out there that aren't being solved, that aren't being addressed. So the edgy part was the balance that you just highlighted in your comment. And I stopped doing that for a while. And then around the pandemic, I kind of revived this idea and created something called the Progress Network, which was a nonprofit dedicated to being a megaphone for stories of the world that were good, things were going well, which in the middle of the pandemic and the election of 2020 was in short supply. And one could argue that at the point that we're recording this in the fall of 2025 is in even shorter supply. And I'll just give you the one, nugget about this, which is, I don't know whether the future is going to be better. My optimism is not a predicate of things are going to be fine, calm down. It is, none of us know what the future is going to hold. far too often we do a dotted line from the present into the future and assume that what we think is really important now is going to be really important then. And way too often, as you know, looking back, those assumptions are wrong, right? That the assumption that the bad thing in the present or the good thing in the present is going to lead to an even worse thing in the future or an even better thing in the future are often just wrong, because none of us know. So my optimism is a humility about, like, we don't know. And therefore we should be open to more possibilities. And our current political, economic, social commentariat and interactive commentary pretty much assumes that we know the future is going to be worse. And all I'm trying to do is say, we're not adequately considering the possibility that A, maybe that's wrong, and B, maybe the future will be better.
Ventures and Visionaries is grateful to be sponsored by KJ Technology. For over 25 years, KJ has helped middle market businesses unlock growth through strategic technology advisory services. Whether you're a fast-moving alternative financial firm or a boutique wealth management office, KJ delivers tailored managed IT solutions that scale with your ambitions. And for those who only demand the best at home, KJ brings enterprise-grade network technology to high-end residential environments, blending performance, security, and vendor management from the boardroom to the living room. KJ Technology is redefining what it means to be connected, protected, and empowered. Learn more at kjtechnology.com or email for information at info@kjtechnology.com. What would you say to a young person who's now trying to get a job, or to somebody in the middle of their career who needs to reinvent themselves? And, you know, they're clearly in an inflection point in their lives, and being measured is probably a good thing, but how does one find opportunities in today's economic climate, I suppose?
So the young people getting a job has been, to some degree, an oft-repeated issue since really at least 2008. It has had some ebbs and flows, but it's had more ebbs than flows. I'm probably going to say something that isn't popular that some people won't like, which is most younger people in their early 20s who are college graduates who are having a hard time getting a job are having a hard time getting the job they want. They're not having a hard time finding employment. And I am not saying that with any judgment or pejorative. Like, I don't think, therefore, you should just get a job at McDonald's if you can't get a job at Morgan Stanley or at Google, right? But there's some optionality there. If you're living in your parents' basement, it's because you can live in your parents' basement. And I know some people are going to scream at that statement, but the statement is there is employment to be had, but if you have a college degree, it's kind of legitimate to say I'm going to give myself 12 to 24 months to try to find the job that's commensurate with my passion, skills, etc., and not just take any job. Or maybe you do take any job, but then you look for a better job. And yeah, it's harder to find that better job. It's a competitive workforce. AI is in the early stages of disrupting certain things that would have been entry-level jobs, like data input or frontline customer service, although it's not disrupting it, quite as much as people say it's disrupting it. I think a lot of that will come, but hasn't yet come. Software engineers, right? It used to be like everyone got software engineering because there was just a plethora of software engineering jobs. Now they're not. Over time, if you have a college degree in the United States, full stop, your long-term employment prospects are good. Now, you can't dine out on the statistical likelihood that your long-term employment prospects are good, but you can calm down a little about it is likely that if you stick with it, your long-term prospects will be better. And I would say, look, the one caveat to that is the problem of like LinkedIn and AI going through keywords in resumes that AI itself has generated is it's a low probability way to find a job. Whereas human to human interaction, finding contacts, networking is a higher probability way of finding a job. So if you're applying for a job and there are 1,000 resumes that have come for one job because there was a posting on LinkedIn, it's a total crapshoot.
Funnily enough, that was not any different when people looked at the New York Times classified or had to do it some other way. Still a crapshoot sending resumes into the ether.
It's true. Although the one difference is you might have had a person who was interested in your resume in that crapshoot. Whereas now you're just as likely to have an AI bot dismiss your resume for just purely quantitative criteria.
It's interesting.
And I would say that's the only thing that is a little more of a disadvantage.
So we go back to the fact that relationships build business and relationships build the economy. And so long as people are maintaining the investment, and probably the underlying piece over here was the motivation around doing that kind of work, which it really is, then the prospects are probably not nearly as dire as people would make them sound.
Yeah, and it's hard, I think, if you're just a recent college graduate and you're swimming in kind of the ether of TikTok and Instagram Reels and X and whatever social milieu, and what you're hearing is, oh my God, we're screwed, and there goes the future, and I'll never own a home. And it's hard not to digest those messages as truth, rather than those are just messages of various people with various opinions at a moment in time. So I get that being able to distance yourself from that is a challenge. It's a human challenge. We're social animals. We take the cues from those around us. And of course, statistics in the face of emotions are useless. Not only useless, they're sometimes incendiary. Like if you feel fraught, nervous, concerned, all for legitimate reasons, and someone like me comes along and says, well, don't worry, you're statistically likely to get a good job, that can seem callous, indifferent, insensitive, all the wrong things. So, I mean, I get that as well, even as I'm guilty of saying it. But I do think, we all have the capacity to step back from our monkey brain and take a deep breath and ask ourselves, are our fears commensurate with reality, right? Are we scared because there's actually a huge crisis brewing, or there is a huge crisis, or is it just an anxious time, or some combination of the two,
Yeah,
right?
as you're speaking, it struck me how odd it is that we're perfectly capable, as people who consume sports and various other entertainment situations like that, and we're happy to analyze the statistics ad nauseum and understand exactly what every person is perfectly capable of doing, how fast the ball is rotating, how far it's thrown, how fast they're running, and we're not able to digest that when it comes towards us, as you're more statistically likely, just like baseball player is more statistically likely to reach first base if they're a 333 hitter as opposed to a 250 hitter.
And the present hasn't changed so much, right? I mean, AI may over time. There's a line, I think a lot of people have used it. I'm sure someone came up with it initially. Don't know who that was. That we overestimate the disruptive effects of new technologies in the short term and underestimate them in the long term. Now with AI, we're probably guilty of overestimating both. Meaning we're both estimating the short-term effects and the long-term effects. And if you're an AI doomsayer, right, if you believe that we're 5 years away from the singularity of artificial intelligence that is self-conscious, and that we're going to be in some dystopian agglomeration of the Matrix and Terminator in the next 5 years, I mean, the reality is, if you actually believe that, we're screwed anyway. So I don't know. I don't even know what you do with that fear, other than just try to have as much fun as you can until until it's done, right?
That's very funny.
Because again, there's no. I mean, if that is baked in, there's nothing you and I are going to do about it, and nothing your clients are going to do about it. No one's going to call up Mordy and go, "Hey, man, help me out here." You're
Yeah,
like,
there's a super intelligence out there fighting us, and like, yeah, thank you very much. We'll just surrender now.
Do your bucket list while you can. Like, accelerate your bucket list.
That actually, funnily enough, is an interesting idea. That said, I agree with you. I don't think that we're talking about a 5-year horizon, but maybe speak a little bit about, from your perspective as a thinker and somebody who's looking for all the good news, or just in general, how are you thinking about the disruption and the change that AI may or may not bring forth, and what does that mean for people today in the marketplace?
So first of all, in a way that was, I guess, a little bit true of the late 90s, when everybody was just putting .com after their business because they felt like it would make them cooler and increase their valuation. Like, everybody is suddenly talking about AI and integrating AI and making AI a fundamental aspect of their business. And everybody is an AI expert, and everybody has strong AI opinions. And nobody knows nearly as much as even the people who are experts say they do. And I feel pretty confident in that statement, meaning I feel pretty confident in the statement of even the people who know a lot know less than they claim. Or rather, they know a lot about what's going on in AI right now. They are not necessarily more expert in predicting where AI will go in the future. And in fact, often the people who are most expert in an area are most wrong about what they think is going to happen in the future, right? So if you'd been a Sovietologist in March of 1989, chances are pretty good you were just wrong about the future of the Soviet Union. Because on very few people's bingo cards in the spring of 1989 was the Soviet Union will be gone by 1992. Like that was not a view in mainstream. Nor if you were an Iran specialist in July of 1978, there was not a lot of people whose future prognostications were saying in 4 years there'll be an Islamic theocracy ruling Iran. So just like keep that in mind about, and the nuclear scientists in the 1950s who were like, we're going to have nuclear powered cars by the 1970s.
Sure.
So,
Flying cars last week.
Or Elon saying that, self-driving cars are going to replace everything by 2025. And here we are, and they haven't. So just take that into consideration next time you hear Jeffrey Hinton, who's a brilliant AI scientist, or Sam Altman, who's running, OpenAI, the largest AI company. Their statements about what the future of AI is going to be are that one person's opinion, maybe a very informed person, but they are still one person's opinion about the future. And as we know in the past, sometimes the most informed people are wrong. So I'm one guy with an opinion, way less informed than these people about the nature of AI, and a consumer of AI only in the most cursory fashion. I'm not a software engineer. I'm not a quant. I'm not a Wall Street quant. I'm not an actual quant. I don't think quantly. I sometimes do think quantitatively, but I'm not a quant. So with all those caveats, I would say, it is likely over time that AI will do a lot of what we think it's going to do, which is that it will replace people doing repetitive tasks, just like automation, Taylor processes in the 20th century, Henry Ford, over time, the trend of technology has been machines replace people. And I think in that sense, AI will be very much like that on steroids. It will simply replace a lot of repetitive human tasks, of which basic software engineering, a lot of customer service, a lot of data entry, a lot of simple calculations. And that may be a negative for workforce. Although I think in the next 3 to 5 years, as you're already seeing now, companies will preemptively fire people thinking that they can replace it with AI bots. They'll replace customer service with AI bots who then mess up. And then they'll hire consultants to help them fix all the things that are broken when they've used AI to replace human beings. And I know, you run a technology business. I'm sure you're facing these same questions, which is be very careful before you replace a person with an AI bot, unless you're pretty sure that AI bot can do at least as well as the person that you're firing. Because if not, you're going to have to hire someone or pay someone to remediate the harms that you've done by firing the person in the first place, which means instead of saving money, it will have cost you money. And I think a lot of companies are going to find that.
The ROI calculations here are absurd. That said, the insights that an AI bot, for lack of a better term, can provide are interesting. And I was listening to some of your What Can Go Right podcast, and I think you were talking recently about AIs in the mental health space.
Yeah, I mean, when I say bots, I mean I'm just like using whatever patois we want to use, algorithms,
Sure, machine
you name
learning,
it.
LLM, and whatever. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I'm not suggesting that it can replace people. Firstly, I completely agree with you. And the point that I just wanted to make on top of that is I think that if you are a person and you can leverage an AI, for lack of a better term, and make the combination of human plus machine to add up to a greater sum than machine alone or human alone, then why would you not do that? Then frankly, that sounds to me like a win.
Yeah, and a lot of people have kind of made that equation. I mean, Garry Kasparov early on made this of, machines alone beat people, but people combined with machines beat both people and machines. At least that's been the fusion. Now, the superintelligence promoters would say that's only true until you have superintelligence, at which point that equation breaks down and superintelligence, wins. Look, the other thing is we're in a dystopian moment. And so the future vision of what AI will do is filtered through a dystopian lens. And in that dystopian lens, rather than the kaleidoscope being a kind of messy combination of good, banal, and bad, we tend to come out with bad. Again, The Matrix and Terminator. We don't tend to come out with utopia. So that we're basically, to be financial about it, we're under indexing for utopia and over indexing for Armageddon. And in that, we fail to recognize the possibilities of AI, which, any promoter of AI would say, look, there's incredible potential here in terms of drug discovery, protein analysis for biotech, calculations about composite materials and using them in construction, solving equations that remain, even with high computing power, arduous and difficult, let alone the possibilities of AI merged with quantum computing, which is a whole other framework that doesn't tend to get talked about as much. So the kind of endless frontier of AI as a problem solver for things that remain challenging, climate change, ways to remediate or mitigate or both climate change, techniques, all of this can be vastly enhanced if AI is doing the calculations. And the fact that we are less focused on that and more focused on the computers taking over is indicative of our current moment. But that doesn't mean that our current moment is seeing things clearly.
It also doesn't mean that our current moment will remain this way forever. Um, what would you say if we, as individuals in a collective, for lack of a better term, the United States of America today, what does each individual need to do to kind of change that overall perspective from your
I mean, one thing I've been trying to do with the Progress Network, and we do this podcast called What Could Go Right, and in addition to my own column on Substack called the Edgy Optimist, which goes to about 25,000 people, and then we do a newsletter called What Could Go Right at the Progress Network, which goes to another 100,000 people. We try to highlight stories of things that are going well, disease eradication in West Africa, rising literacy in various parts of the world that have lagged, rising lifespans, increasing public goods, all the things that are in fact happening. But you wouldn't really know that they're happening if you read the news in quotes, because the news is almost always bad news, because that's the nature of news. It's liminal. It's meant to, particularly in a social media age, it's meant to be clickbait, meaning it's supposed to grab your attention. Otherwise, your attention will go elsewhere. And unfortunately, human beings being set up as they are, we don't tend to, our attention isn't grabbed by good stories. So you look at the paper and it's going to be 82 degrees and sunny, and you register that, but you don't register that nearly as much as you register there's a Category 5 hurricane coming, and tape your windows and seek shelter. And look, you could argue that that's a perfectly rational, legitimate thing, that we are, as a species, wired for risks and to respond excessively to protect ourselves in the face of risks. And you don't need to protect yourself in the face of benign circumstances, so therefore you don't register them as much. That's all fine and well at a kind of survivalist basis, but it doesn't serve us when it's a collective reality. And we need to make an effort to find stories of things going well, or stories that augur better things. And we need to be willing to take those in and digest them, at least, if not equally to the negative, partly, so it's not overwhelmed. And again, there's all these cognitive studies of, what is it, like takes 10 good comments to override one bad comment from a parent or a teacher or an authority for a boss. If you admonish someone who's working for you, they're much more likely to carry that with them for a longer time than a compliment. Like, there's not a one-to-one offset. So like really negative things imprint much more deeply than really positive things. Over time, maybe not.
It's interesting that definitely the negative resonates more strongly, and I'm certainly no neurologist, but from what I understand, when one goes into the reptilian brain, that becomes a very, very strong, as you said, survival mechanism. I wonder if this also may have something to do with it. Like back in the day, before I was carrying a supercomputer in my hand, when I went into the subway or wherever it was that I am, I didn't have the ability to perpetually be digesting more and more and more information. Maybe I did have a moment to process and think to myself, yeah, it's a category 5 hurricane, but it's in Florida. So yes, that's bad, and it's bad for the people over there, but it doesn't really impact me, at least today in New York. Maybe it will in 2 weeks, but the processing time, and now we have all these apps to be mindful and be thoughtful and be kind and gratitude journaling and all the rest of that stuff, which again, I'm not minimizing at all. I'm just simply saying that perhaps if we had a little bit more downtime built into our schedule, we'd be able to find that a little bit more organically. Who knows?
Yeah, I mean, the amusingness of reality, right? You need apps to offset apps in order to get you to a place of balance that you might have had in the absence of both of the apps. Uh, Although I think, as you pointed out before, we romanticize the past relative to the present at our peril, and I think one of the great challenges of today's world is an excess of past rose-tinted Pollyannish fairy tales. You know, that things. You know, you and I think both grew up in New York in the '70s, right, or '60s and
Yep.
'70s, and you know, part of my response to kind of the disintegration of some public order during COVID and its aftermath was, yeah, it's bad, but it's it's a lot better than the 1970s.
Nobody
Like
remembers that.
the you know, the nadir of 2020 was disconcerting, to say the least, and the absence of people was the most disconcerting. Like, you didn't have that in the '70s. But in terms of like crime and safety, there other than a few weeks in 2020, there really wasn't much of a comparison, and there still isn't. You know, it's like, and yet nobody lives historically, meaning we do judge our present by itself, and we have expectations going forward that are not constantly colored by, oh, it was better or worse then. But the feeling of it being better than, I think, is one of the most pernicious aspects of contemporary political culture, not just in the United States, but in many parts of the
Interesting.
world. This kind of, you know, in Russia, there's been a resurgence of, hey, things weren't so bad under Stalin. We had food, security.
Really?
Like, things were kind of bad under
There
Stalin.
was no food insecurity.
Right. I mean, maybe not as much nostalgia under Stalin, but definitely nostalgia for the Soviet
Yeah.
Union. A lot of nostalgia for the Soviet Union. And I think a lot of the American narrative is framed in a belief of things were better then,
So
and that's true on both the left and the right.
it's interesting. When I was a kid, I got the lectures of, you better study history because those who don't study history are doomed to repeat it. And I think you have an academic background in the study as well. So maybe share a little bit more from your current perspective. Like, what do I try to mine history for in the lessons that I do want to bring forward without overcompensating one way or another?
Yeah, I mean, I do think those who forget history are doomed to repeat it is a false statement. I think knowing history is essential because it reminds us of what's possible, and also grounds us in the awareness that the present is always messy, right? Everybody you look back at was grappling with a present whose future they didn't know. And you can glean some things about mistakes that were made, except for the fact that picking the perfect historical analogy to a present issue is a fool's errand. Like, nothing scans perfectly. What does scan perfectly is that human beings constantly face particular challenges. They are usually missing crucial details, and they often make the wrong decisions relative to what they were trying to achieve, in ways that you can learn from in the present in terms of the discipline that you bring to, how do I make the right decision for the outcomes I'm trying to achieve. So that can be really valuable in terms of history. And the other thing is to remind ourselves of what has happened before as a, if not a palliative, then a gentle reminder to calm the F down about the present being so radically other, that human beings have never faced this before. That this is, like, there are things you've never faced before. You've never faced having a supercomputer in your pocket. We've never faced having this much information. We've never faced the velocity of information. We've never faced an administration, and I say this hopefully in a nonpartisan way, with so many people who have been so aggrieved by so many perceived or real slights and missteps in the past, who have all been assembled and now given a degree of power and are determined to either right past wrongs or rectify past slights. Like, those are all new things. But chaos, disorder, uncertainty, fear of the unknown, the sense that we're on the brink of something that's really bad, the feeling that we've developed technologies that could kill us. I mean, nuclear fear in the 1950s was pretty damn intense. You know, people didn't know if they were going to destroy the human race, having unleashed the power of the atom, just like we don't know the consequences of AI. And to say that the fear about AI is completely different than the fear of nuclear weapons is just ridiculous. It isn't completely different. It's rather similar. The only difference is we don't know the outcome of this one. We knew the outcome of that one, or at least we know the outcome of that one to this moment in time. So I do think you should mine history for the awareness of, and for me, it's a calming influence of like, oh, right, you know, story of human history is complicated, challenging, ugly. And yet here we are arguing about it, writing about it somewhat calmly, which at least suggests that net, for all the harms that we have done, here we are.
And here we are in a much better place.
And here we are in a much better place materially, culturally, rule of law.
Yeah.
I've been saying for the past few months, it's striking that when you make positive generalizations, there's some sort of demand that you caveat that with a yes, but. Like, every positive generalization has to genuflect in the direction of all the things that remain wrong. Whereas if you make a sweeping statement about, wow, there's just malnourishment throughout the world still, people are undernourished, or they're eating hollow calories even though they have enough calories. You just get to say that. If you say there's less starvation than ever before and more caloric abundance, you have to caveat that with, yes, but there's still malnutrition. And the point I'm making by that is that's indicative of our culture. Like, in the 90s, you didn't have to do that. And maybe that was a bad thing. Like, you could make positive generalizations and not do a yes, but. Today, it's like, if you don't do the yes, but, you can easily be accused of being callous, indifferent to suffering. Like, look, there's always human suffering. Human beings are radically imperfect and often destructive.
I don't think that, I wonder where that assumption comes from, but I just want to take this in a slightly different direction for a second. Do you think that is always true? Like, for example, if I were to say, medicine used to think that bloodletting was a good thing. Like, do you think there's still a yes, but at the end of that statement? Or it's really just, in areas that have become, I don't know, less perfect?
Well, let's take the most current debate about vaccines and their safety and efficacy. You used to be able to say vaccines have been responsible for eradicating many of the diseases that imperiled human beings for, a long time. Malaria, cholera, measles, mumps, polio. And yes, you could say malaria and cholera in particular were also eradicated, or even maybe more primarily eradicated by not medicines. I mean, there's no malaria vaccine, but they're malaria medicines. But as much by public health, clean water, sanitation as they were by any medicines, which is true. But you can't make those statements as easily today because we're questioning efficacy in a particularly dramatic way. Maybe that's because all these things were somewhat oversold, or they were, risks weren't acknowledged, because there's always risks. Like, there's no such thing as perfect medicine, or there's no such thing as good medicine that doesn't harm a few people. And how you balance that societally. Like, look, the problem with vaccines is that we should have been acknowledging all along that if you administer 10 million vaccines, it is just almost certain that a small percentage of people will be profoundly harmed by those vaccines, even if the vast majority of people will be profoundly helped. And for a long time, we basically said, look, societally, the good of the many outweighs the good of the few. And you don't get to opt out of that reality, even if you're the parent of a child who's going to die or develop problems because they get that vaccine. In today's world, we don't know how to balance that reality, because most people are faced with the question of, like, if there's a 1 in 100,000 chance that little Johnny, your baby, is going to die from this vaccine, if you just asked a parent that before the shot, most people go like, no way, I'm not doing anything that can harm my child, except for the fact we let kids swim and we let them go on the trampoline and we let them ski, all of which are much more, and we let them be in the backseat of a car, all of which will much more likely kill them.
But that's a separate issue.
Right. Anyway, I guess my point is, there's a lot, there are fewer and fewer things that we get to generalize about positive.
I wonder where that comes from. Like where did that start? Is that and that's certainly in the last 5-10 years. That wasn't like that a decade or
Yeah,
so.
the extreme of it. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting.
Um,
Certainly something to think
and
about.
then you have the really, that some of the dynamic of the Trump administration, again, not being
That's fine.
political here, is a kind of things were really bad and we've now made them better. And that's also an increasing reality. Like it wasn't true for every presidential administration in US history to constantly do kind of a black and white comparison with the past administration. I mean, yeah, to some degree, when you're running for election, you want to say I was good, they were bad. I'm going to be better, they're going to be worse. I mean, that's always right. The equation: vote for me, not for them. Because if you vote for me, things will get better, and if you vote for them, things will get worse. But the kind of you know uh, lack of historical nuance is, I think, if not new, more extreme in today's world.
Yeah, the lack of being able to trust leadership perhaps went away during certain scandals where, X was promised and Y was delivered, or people experienced it differently.
Sure, but as we know from the 1970s, where trust in government really cratered in the late 1970s in the wake of Watergate. Like now we look back at Watergate, 1974, August, Nixon resigns, and people then say, well, the system worked. It brought someone to account. Presidential malfeasance was held accountable. But a lot of people in the late 70s didn't feel that way. I mean, they didn't feel like, well, great, the system worked. They felt like everything's broken. We can't trust government. The CIA is assassinating people. So it's true that there was in the 1980s a kind of return to American optimism relative to the darkness of the 70s. Um, and then you had like the optimism of the 90s cresting with the NASDAQ bubble in March of 2000. And then it all sort of collapses with September 11th, 2001. And we've kind of been on a downward trajectory with little blips ever since. Maybe a moment of enthusiasm when Obama gets elected, first black president. A lot of people celebrate that, across the partisan divide. Um, but on the whole, it's been a pretty dyspeptic 24 years, since September 11th, 2001. And that's a long cycle, which doesn't seem in any risk of ending anytime soon.
Yeah, I wonder again. I go back to the idea that look, where you're doing what you're doing, you're getting out, you have reach, and obviously that's wonderful. And I also try to think of the people that I impact in my small microcosm, whether it's my family, my business associates, clients, people I interact with, and social organizations that I deal with, and how is it that I show up, and what is my behavior mean from a leadership perspective? Because look, you're not wrong that bad things did happen rather. So the question is, how do I respond to that, and how do I bring that both into my life and into my business?
What you're speaking to is there are things we can control and there are things we can't. You can control, and I mean that in a constructive way. I don't mean that in a quote unquote controlling way. You can shape the arc of how you behave toward work colleagues, family, people who report to you. That you can shape. Whether or not Russia is or is not going to like continue to bomb eastern Ukraine, you can vote for a representative in every 2 years who may or may not vote to extend American aid to the Ukrainians, and maybe that will be a tipping point. But obviously, your control of that reality is dramatically less than your ability to shape your immediate milieu. And one thing I try to remind people of is that even in a world where we're focused relentlessly in the United States on the powers of or the misuses of power of the federal government, and again, that crosses partisan lines. Obviously, the right felt Biden misused power, the left felt Trump misuses power. The actual power of the federal government to shape most people's lives, while is theoretically large, is in practice minimal. Most of our lives are not directly impacted by what goes on in Washington. Um, and there too, like people scream about, oh my God, you can say that because you're a white privileged male living in New York City and you're not an undocumented immigrant living in the Central Valley of California. And my response to that is, okay, that's absolutely true as a description. But most people aren't undocumented immigrants living in the Central Valley in California, and most people aren't touched by what the federal government does intimately. Usually,
You
that's just a fact, right? values-based statement. It's just we do in fact live in a society where most of us can go about our lives relatively untouched by government power and its potential abuses. And we should remember that. It's a free enough society, even with all these issues, which is not, in my view, saying a recipe for complacency, but it is a recipe for calming down.
I really like that point, mostly because I think that there's a general fallacy that is used very often in media, and that is something that's true in general isn't true on the micro level. And combining the two never gets you really anywhere. Most people are better off because there are less fires in modern cities today. Does that mean that the person whose house happened to burn down last week feels exactly the same way? Probably not. But interviewing that person and talking about all the things that need to happen because society has not done enough to prevent fires is, at some point there's a cost to society to regulation, and then there's the question of overregulation and overreach, and where is that balance? And these are fantastic and interesting questions that I think certainly when you start involving ethics. You spoke a little bit before about, forget exactly what you were saying, but it struck me in terms of, God forbid, if you're a doctor on the scene of a mass casualty, and now your question is, who do you treat first? And how do you ethically determine? Is it the person who's most difficultly treated? Is it the person that you happen to touch? Do you do triage first? How does one even think about these things? And these are just, these are big, big questions that are well beyond my little pea brain.
These have been questions that people have been trying to figure out and will continue to try to figure out forever and ever and anon, and still try to figure out kind of almost beneath the public radar of our current hysterical public sphere, right? We have a hysterical public sphere, and in a bad way. And whether that's about politics and democracy and freedom and the Trump administration and global trade, it's hysterical everywhere, not just in the United States. It's like a global hysteria, certainly fueled in part by the internet, but so is awareness, right? The flip side of frenzy about what's going on is heightened awareness of what's going on everywhere in a way that is new-ish, new enough. And we're kind of grappling with all of that in a new way. How do you digest information about everything, everywhere, all the time? How do you shut it off? How do you take it in? How much do you take in? How much do you shut off? Back to your comment before about the mindfulness apps, and how much do you then toggle from one hysterical app to one calming app? The app that tells you to be scared and the app that tells you to calm down. Which app should you listen to and when?
You should ask
And look,
AI.
we are trying to figure this out, right? We're trying to find some degree of balance, and we have yet to do so. And we will not ever do so perfectly. It just won't happen. Human beings don't tend to find equilibrium. Or if they do find equilibrium, it lasts for a nanosecond before you find some disequilibrium. Or if you're Hegelian, back to history, Hegel, 19th century German philosopher, talked about waves of history being some constant oscillation of there's a thesis, i.e. what's going on, there's an antithesis, i.e. a reaction to what's going on, and then there's a synthesis, i.e. A solution to that crisis. And once you have that, the cycle begins again. There's no, human beings just aren't static.
Yeah,
and the expectation that we're going to be is
and the present is messy, I suppose.
The present is messy. The past isn't clear. It looks clear. It has clear outcomes. We know Hitler started a war and lost a war. But understanding that and interpretations of it change with every generation of historians rewriting the past through the lens of the present. So the present is messy. The past is clear-ish, but not nearly as clear as we think, and the future is unknown. And human desire for certainty about all three leads to wrong conclusions, incorrect answers, and faulty assumptions.
So on that optimistic note, how do we remain grounded and keep ourselves centered?
I look around the world and I am struck by the fact, and I've used this line in multiple interviews and multiple talks, so I'm just going to go with it, that never before have more people in human history enjoyed greater affluence, more material security, longer lives, caloric abundance, the ability to begin to have their dreams and realize them in multiple societies where rule of law tends to predominate, even with multiple exceptions around the world. And never have more people had more and enjoyed more of the fruits of what human beings have tried to create. And never have been more people been royally pissed off. And this juxtaposition of many things being good and the bulk of human beings on the planet right now feeling angry and discontent is one of the great challenges and conundrums of our age. And, my interpretation of it, which is purely that, is that never have more people on the planet felt the agency of individuals who believe that they have a right to have their voices heard and their needs met. That most of human history unfolded under conditions of most people dealing with the hand they were dealt without any particular belief or ability to alter that hand, and often not even imagining that such a thing was possible. And what you have now is 8 billion souls on the planet, most of whom have smartphones of one form or another, most of whom can plug into information, saying, hey, wait a minute, I'm a human being. I believe I have dignity. I believe I have rights. I believe I should have those met. And the systems that I'm born into aren't doing that. And screw you for telling me otherwise. And damn it, I want a world where that is met. Now, that can be incredibly disruptive, really chaotic. Anger, once unleashed from a genie like a bottle, can be destructive or constructive depending on how it's used. And so, I get the concern that it's a volatile situation globally, but I take the churning expectation of I'm a person who should have dignity and rights and needs that are honored and met as a kind of a good thing, net for the world. Like more people with more agency, because I believe in the essential, ultimate collective progress of human nature. And back to where we began this conversation, we're going to end this conversation. The cup half full, cup half empty. If you believe in the inherent goodness of people, which doesn't mean that you ignore the inherent darkness of people. We all have darkness. We all have the immense capacity to destroy. We have all done things that are really uncool in our lives, to someone, to ourselves, you name it. So saying I believe in the inherent goodness of human beings is by no means eliding the fact that we are also pretty inherently bad. But which one of those will out collectively? I tend to believe that collectively we like Martin Luther King said, we bend in the direction of progress. And so I take the current foment as part of that, even if there are immense risks inherent in it.
Zachary, this has been beyond enlightening, and I really appreciate your time and your energy. Any two questions, any passion projects? We spoke about a bunch. Anything else that you'd like to highlight? And lastly, how would people reach out to you if they wanted to connect with you on something?
So I've written a lot of books. You can go to Amazon. They're all on quirky different topics, but I think they're all united by a sense of like what are human beings capable of in a good way. So check those out. You look at my name. The Substack I write called the Edgy Optimist, which is weekly-ish and comes out weekly-ish. You can sign up for it. It's free. You are welcome to pay. I use the money for that to then also support this thing called the Progress Network, which is a few people doing, daily work, beaming out good news via TikTok and Instagram and Facebook and LinkedIn and X, you name it. So all those are ways to do it. And you can always email me at info@rivertwice.com if you want to ask me a question or engage in some way. I'm ready, willing, and able to do so as long as the communications are at least have a modicum of decency and civility. I'm less likely to respond to what is your problem than I am to respond to I would really like to know what your problem is, and engage in that debate. Style matters.
Style does matter, and I think at the undercore of a lot of this is the lack of respect that needs to come back. You can disagree with somebody. That's totally fine. Just respect the fact. I'm a human being. You're a human being. Yeah. We can disagree. That's allowed.
Yes.
in an event. But Zachary, again, thank you. Ventures and Visionaries is grateful to be sponsored by KJ Technology. KJ sits at the intersection of business and technology by providing technology advisory services such as aligning business goals and technology initiatives. Their plans create coherence between the business people and the tech team supporting them. KJ also provides cybersecurity oversight and proactive process implementation to resolve real world issues before they become challenges. For complimentary consultation, please email info@kjtechnology.com.